40th anniversary. And the I came from a ministry background. My father and my grandfather were both pastors for over 50 years each. And so I decided to go into business. I saw enough of ministry to I just didn't want to go do that. And so I started this insurance agency with the idea of being able to insure churches and schools and nonprofits and camps as my kind of my ministry. And about 26 years ago, I really sensed that God had placed a call on my life to plant a church. So my wife and I took the plunge and we planted a church, which I just stepped down from pastoring a little more than a year and a half ago. So I pastored the church for 22 years. And so I've been in the insurance world, the church insurance world, and the church world for a long, long time. And I have great respect for you folks, just knowing, what you have to do in serving in so many capacities, not just being a pastor or not just being a trustee, but with church comes a lot of responsibility that perhaps you didn't think you signed up for, but it's really there. And so I hope today that we're able to, in a very not so long way, talk about something that nobody really likes to talk about, but it's very important, and hopefully we can make this simple and helpful. So I'd like Bjorn, if you would, to introduce yourself. He's a lot smarter than me, and he's also quite astute in risk management and the things we're going to be talking about today. So Bjorn.
Thanks, Greg. I don't know about the smarter part, but anyway, I'm Bjorn Waldron. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing with National Church Group, and I have been doing this for the past 11 years. And part of my, I guess, responsibilities with the agency are risk management for our clients and prospects. So that includes, we'll do informational seminars, trainings. We train a lot of security and safety teams. We do sexual abuse prevention, and then just general insurance education like we're doing today. So really appreciate you having us on and looking forward to it.
So if we can, I'd like to share my screen. I don't know if you guys are ready for that, but I have a PowerPoint presentation that goes with today. Is that something we can do?
Daphne, or did you, are they able to do it?
It says disabled participant screen sharing.
Give it a try now, Greg.
Okay. Okay, that's looking better. All right. Can everybody see that? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Well, again, just to start us off, as a pastor and as a church leader, there's a weight of responsibility. I greatly appreciate what Reverend Redmond said, because you don't learn these things in seminary. There are a few things they forgot to mention, and insurance would be one of those. And so what we want to do is try to give you a nutshell approach to the insurance issue for churches. There's a huge weight of responsibility, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. They're just a couple simple things that you can do to really make this work for you. I will say this. that insurance for your church is not the same as insurance for your home or your apartment or your co-op. This is commercial insurance. It's a much more complex product, much more complex situation. And so you have things you have to insure for within a church that you don't have in any other kind of business or entity. So we're going to talk about some of this. I will say this. I read through the minimum from the Book of Discipline, the minimum insurance requirements. I was pleasantly surprised. This is a document that you really need to pay attention to because everything that we'll talk about is in here. And so somebody has done a really great job on this. My hat is off to the folks who have worked on this, because it's just a really good document to use. And we're going to talk about documents and policies in just a moment. But I'm going to start here and turn this over to Bjorn. And Bjorn, you can get us into our next topic.
Sounds good. Thanks, Greg. So first, I just want to give a real high level kind of overview of what type of policies your church may have. So a church may have a commercial auto policy for your vehicles. You may have workers' comp for your employees, management liability for your leadership, and then a multi-peril or package policy, which is what we're going to be kind of diving into more here. And the package policy usually consists of 3 parts. As you see there, it's property, liability, and crime. And basically the crime portion, that's a property coverage, but basically what that is, it's insuring theft of money. So if it's embezzlement by an employee or volunteer, or theft from the outside, or theft electronically, which we'll talk more in detail about a little later, that's covered in the crime policy. The liability, that's everything for third-party claims made against the church. So within that, you have your professional liability, which would be your church counseling. You have sexual acts liability, general liability for slips and falls and things of that nature, as well as a bunch of other more tailored coverages. And we'll talk about some of those in detail a little later. And then the third one is the property. So that's your church building, church contents within the building, and also, anything else that the church owns. Sometimes it's maybe a nice electronic sign outside, not technically a building, but still covered by the property policy. So within the property, I just want to talk about some risk management issues and things to just be aware of. The first one I want to talk about is valuations, and this one's become a real big risk issue for churches the last few years. So typically on your property policy, if you own a building, the policy will have what's called an inflation guard, which usually it's at 2 or 4%. And what that does is it increases the value of your buildings by that percentage every year, just to keep up with the inflation rate. As you all know, the last few years, the cost of construction and building materials kind of threw that all out of whack. So in 2021, the average increase to cost of construction was about 22%. And then in 2022, it normalized a little bit and went back down to 8%. So either way, the 2% or 4% inflation guard that you may have on your policy is not quite keeping up with the actual rate of inflation. So property value is something you want to keep a close look at if you have, and some policies don't even have the inflation guard, in which case you probably really need to take a look at the value and make sure that if something were to happen to your building, could you rebuild it at the same level? For example, we work with a church, a large Baptist church in Brooklyn, and when we were working with them last year, they had a value on their policy for their building, and I went out and did an independent building valuation just to ensure we were insuring it at the right value. And it turned out that their value on their policy hadn't been updated in 10 years. So when their agent wrote the policy 10 years ago, it just stayed at that value. And obviously inflation has gone up every year. So my valuation came in higher to the tune of $2 or $3 million. So just something to think of on your property policy. Is the valuation where it needs to be to replace the building? The next thing I'll talk about is the valuation replacement cost. So typically property policies are written on a replacement cost basis, which just means that if the building were to be damaged or destroyed, it would be, the policy would pay to replace it with like, kind, or quality. Now, sometimes they're written on actual cash value or functional replacement cost, which insurance companies will do that sometimes if the building's not in great shape or if it's vacant or something to that effect. And that means that they're only going to pay to replace it to the depreciated value. So they're not going to pay the full replacement cost. Another thing to think about with the replacement cost is if you have a historic building. I know a lot of Methodist churches have beautiful historic buildings, it might even be on the historic registry. And these buildings, replacement costs might not even be enough, because when they built the building 100, 150 years ago, they used materials that maybe aren't around today. And there's a coverage out there in the industry called historic replacement cost. And what that means is the insurance company will basically pay to find the same materials wherever they are in the world to replace that building to its original splendor if something were to happen to it. So if you have a historic building, another thing to maybe keep in mind. Next thing I want to talk about on the property side is deductibles. And I saw a question come up. We'll try and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So you can put them in the chat or just hold them, and we'll try and get all the questions at the end. But on your property policy, you have a property deductible, and this could range anywhere from $1,000 to $50,000. And just a risk management thing to keep in mind is lower deductibles are not always better. It may seem better because if you have a claim, obviously you're paying less out of pocket yourself. But insurance companies evaluate their clients not just on the amount of money they pay out in claims, but on the amount of claims they pay out. So for example, if an insurance company is looking at your church's loss history over the last 5 years, and say you have $1,000 deductible and you have some water damage that costs $2,000 to repair. So you turn in a claim and get $1,000 out of the policy to fix the issue, which is fine. But an insurance company will look at those claims, and if there's, over a 5-year period, maybe 5 or 6 of these little claims, it raises red flags to them, because what it's telling them is maybe you're not taking care of your building, maybe you're using the insurance policy as a maintenance policy, and in their mind, these little claims are just a matter of time before it's a big claim. So then they may raise rates, they may cancel the coverage, that kind of thing. So a better way to think about deductibles is determine what a level is, that below that level, you're just going to repair everything yourself if you have an issue. So it may be 5,000, it may be 10,000. I met with a church a month or so ago that said, if something happens to our building, we just fix it ourselves unless the whole thing goes down. So I said, okay, well, in that case, it may be a good idea just to put a real big deductible on, since you told me you're going to fix everything yourself. And then what that does is it lowers your annual premium significantly. So increasing your deductible to at least 2,500, 5,000, 10,000, to really leave that for the big stuff. And and that's mainly just for your building. Like other coverages, like the crime coverage, those have separate deductibles that are much lower. So just a risk management thing, maybe determine what that level is for your church, and it could end up saving you a bunch on premium. So I will pass it over to Greg to talk about our next risk issue.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to speed you up, Bjorn, by hitting the button. I'm sorry. I did want to comment on the valuation thing as well. There are things that go into building value that you might not necessarily think of right away. Stained glass is one of those organs, pipe organs, because they are actually attached to the building. That's considered part of the building. We have a church in the Upper West Side that literally their glass and two pipe organs are valuated higher than the rest of the property itself. And so you need to take into consideration when you're evaluating the property, these kinds of situations on valuation. Valuation is different than appraisals. If you get an appraisal on your property, that's what you think it might sell for if you wanted to sell it or if you needed to sell it. Valuation is what it takes to rebuild your building. And so that needs to be done by people who know how to do that. If you have a good church insurance company, the people that work there are able to provide that for you. That's part of our job. So that's what we're working with. I'm going to talk to you for a moment about three major risk issues that churches are facing today. And these are major only because of the numbers of claims and the high amount of claims that we run into with these. And the first one, I'm sure you're quite aware of. It's the big newsmaker, but it's sexual misconduct in the church. And when this coverage first came out decades ago, it was always concerning some type of misconduct with a child. And that's actually gravitated to a few other things as well. But one of the things that you really need to pay attention to is coverage and policies to take care of the church. The coverage protects the church from any kind of a sexual misconduct accusation, but the church needs its own policies to help prevent these kinds of situations. And one of the worst things that can happen is for you as a church to have a child protection policy and then ignore your own policy. That's when the worst can happen. And it's when people were asking questions, well, why did you have a policy and you didn't keep your own policies? And I'm not talking insurance policies. I'm talking about activity policies or handbooks. So I know that your denomination has a lot of information on this and can help you if you don't have a child protection policy in place for your Sunday schools or for any interaction that you have with children, daycare, preschool, whatever it is. The child molestation coverage is absolutely important. I think at one point in the Book of Discipline, it recommends a minimum of $200,000 of coverage. Our minimums are $300,000, and then based on your activity and your handbooks, we can take that up as high as $1 million, and then your umbrella can go over top of that as well. And so the more children you have, the more activity you have, the more you need to look at the child protection side of the sexual misconduct. The second area that is now showing up more than ever before is the workplace and volunteer sexual harassment arena. And these are lawsuits that come because of workplace challenges and volatility, and the volunteer sexual harassment comes more in with the church because there's so many volunteers in the system. And so you want to make sure that your coverages are going to cover you in the event that something like this happens. There's so many sad stories that we can tell in this one area. I would say that one of the most difficult ones, other than child molestation, which is absolutely the worst, but this probably the second worst thing is false accusations, and that happens. There are times when we've had through the years people who were accused of something, and it was later discovered that it was just an angry person trying to mess up the church. And so you want to make sure that you have these coverages and that they're strong, and and you also have your workplace policy manuals set up so that you can make sure that you do your part to protect your church from this number one liability issue. The next one is what we would call professional liability. It's made up of three different categories, and two of these, the first two, are really pertinent when you have employees in your church or school. Employment practices liability is a highly active liability claim. A disgruntled employee is a disgruntled employee, and they will sue when they're disgruntled. Many churches do not have this coverage, and it drives us crazy because it is a potentially huge settlement, and it's a real thing that's happening more all the time. And so employment practices liability needs to be one of the checkups you do when you're looking at your policy. Do we have this coverage? And it'll be stated as an actual coverage in your policy. Employee benefits liability is the other employee related liability coverage. And this protects you in the event that you would do something even by mistake, where somebody loses their benefits or loses part of their pension or whatever. We had a church recently where a well-meaning staff member canceled the health insurance for their entire employee base because they thought that they were going to help save some money, and that is not good. And so, you just want to make sure that's it. That's not a coverage that gets used a lot, but when you need it, it's there, and it's not very costly. So you can keep that in your thinking too. Directors and officers liability is a huge part of what needs to be in your liability policy. These coverages that we call them D&O, or directors and officers liability. These things are the kinds of coverages for trustees, for your board members, for your vestry, depending on who your leaders are in the church. Anybody who directs leadership in the church, anybody who's an officer, has some personal liability because of your position. Now, different states handle this differently. New York handles it different than Connecticut. And so there are limitations that can be made. I believe in New York, you don't have the liability nearly as much as you do in the state of Connecticut. And so you just want to make sure that you know what you have. But again, this is a really important coverage, and you want to protect your directors and your officers. That's the second risk that we want to talk about. The third one is the new and upcoming liability issue, cyber exposure. And I was really, again, I was pleasantly surprised to see this was addressed in your minimum insurance requirements. But things that get put into these documents don't always end up in an insurance policy. And cyber coverage is a new deal. I just gosh, probably 3 months ago, ran into some people that were not our insureds, but their church had just been hacked, and they were held under ransom for their database until they paid $75,000 to get their database released. And they didn't have any coverage for that. And they ended up, I mean, it was a larger church, and they ended up paying the ransom because they couldn't, they just had all their data lost. And so you can have third-party people that you use for receiving funds or with your data, but it's you're not guaranteed that you won't have a cyber exposure. So you're going to want to have a good cyber policy. Just one issue with this is the issue of notification. So let's say that somebody hacks into your database and they steal a bunch of proprietary information. You immediately are required to tell everybody in your database what has just happened. And you can't write your own letter. You have to hire an attorney who knows how to write a letter of addressing your private information. And the actual cost of those letters right now, the average cost is $162 per notification. So if you have 500 people on your rolls and your database gets hacked, and you have to send out a letter to all these people, it's $162 times 500 just to notify people of what's happened. So it's much better to have the cyber policy and one that's really comprehensive. We have some that are tied to our church insurance programs that we don't sell because it's just not comprehensive enough to really give you the coverage. And so we've gone outside of our norms to find these coverages. So that's I think that's all I have on the liability side. There's our advertisement, and you might want to take a picture of that. Bjorn I put his name in there because he's the guy to talk to. And like I said, he knows more than I do about this stuff. And I will say,
Add a little bit on the cyber.
what's that?
Can I add a little
Oh
bit?
yeah, please.
I just wanted to mention many, if not most, companies writing church insurance now are including at least a little bit of cyber liability coverage on their package policies, usually 25 or 50,000. And that's pretty much just coverage for claims brought against you, like the notification costs and data breach and that type of thing. What that's not covering is like the ransom scenario that Greg said, or cyber crime, or that kind of thing. So if you do have cyber liability on your policy, I would just check to see what it's actually covering. We actually did have a client of ours that had a hack. It was a phishing scheme. So, we see this a lot with churches now, where someone will send an email to the treasurer pretending to be the pastor, executive director, and saying, I need X amount of dollars sent here, and they'll send it thinking it's someone that they know and trust, and then find out it was a scam. So that kind of thing, if you purchase a separate cyber policy, it's usually included in that. And separate cyber policies usually have two components. There's the first party coverages, which is for your direct loss. So, you know, if you have money stolen electronically or that kind of thing. And then there's the third party coverages, which is for, you know, claims brought against you from a cyber related event. So these policies are always changing because the cyber exposure is always changing. So having a separate cyber policy is really beneficial because those companies are updating their forms almost every year to address the cyber threat.
The only other thing that I wanted to mention, and actually Bjorn, you might want to jump in on this too. We shut this down during COVID because we simply couldn't do it, but we offer church security and school security conferences for churches and private Christian schools. And we show churches how to build a security team and how to do your best to prevent active shooter situations or how to respond in those situations. We have one this week in DC that we're doing. We're working on a big school security conference in West Virginia, and we'd like to come to New York here pretty soon and get back. We've done several in New York. I think several in Manhattan. We'd like to get back into New York sometime, hopefully this year or early next year. And Bjorn, you may have more information on that, but just thought that we could make this available to everybody in society.
Yeah, no, we don't have anything set in stone yet, but like you said, we hope to, you know, come and do the security training up in New York sometime either later this year or early next year. And if there's enough interest within this group, we could just do one for this group. But yeah, just something to mention.
Okay. Well, I think that's all we have, and Pastor, you could tell us what to do next.
Well, I think the best thing to do right now is just look, there was a couple of questions, and you want to make sure that those questions were answered. Comfort, did you feel like you got your question answered regarding does the church need to do evaluation every year?
And not answered at least to my understanding yet. Is it necessary to have the evaluations yearly? And I also don't know the difference between the church valuation and it seems like it's a replacement policy. Help me figure the two out. Is the church valuation thing same as replacement in case of a damage to a church?
Bjorn, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So the replacement cost is just how the insurance company values the building. So that just means that the limit on the policy, whether your building limit is $1 million, that means that if the building were to be wiped out completely, they would replace it with like, kind, or quality up to the limit on the policy, $1 million. So that's what the replacement cost is. The valuation is how you arrive at the $1 million. So, you know, like I said, the values are changing so rapidly. And to answer the previous question, no, I wouldn't say you need to do one every year. Typically, that should be your agent's job. So us as an agency, we're evaluating our clients' policies every year and making sure that the building is keeping up with the industry and inflation and everything like that. But like we've seen, sometimes that's not being done. And so I would say, as a general rule, every few years you should be looking at your building value and seeing if it's up to date with where it should be.
Thank you.
I think that's a good point too, that the way we deal with this is that we actually come out, we've measured your building, and unless you've added something new, we have all the information in our system. So our building valuators are actually reevaluating your property every year. And you may have an agency that does that as well. But this is something actually I forgot to mention earlier, but this is so important with your church versus your home. Replacement cost on a homeowner's insurance policy or an apartment insurance policy or co-op, whatever you have, has guaranteed replacement cost. So in other words, if you had it insured for $300,000, but it got wiped out, and to replace it was, $380,000, your policy would pay the $380,000. But insurance for commercial properties or churches or schools does not have guaranteed replacement cost. It's replacement cost up to the amount that you have insured. So that's a huge difference between what you're used to with your house or your condo versus your church, because you won't exceed that number that you have on your insurance policy.
On that note, another thing that we didn't mention, but that you might look at on your property policy, is the co-insurance percentage. And typically, policies are written at either 80, 90, or 100% co-insurance. And all that means is 100% co-insurance means you're insuring the building to the full value. 80% means you're required to carry at least 80% of the value of the building on the policy. And where that comes into play is in the event of a claim, if you had an 80% co-insurance on your property policy and it was determined that you were actually only carrying 60% of the building value on the policy, then there would be a co-insurance penalty. And what that means is the insurance company is only going to pay the same proportion of the amount that you carried on the church's policy. It's kind of confusing, but just make sure that the co-insurance percentage on your policy, that your building is insured to at least that percentage of the actual replacement cost.
There's
I'm going to
part-
ask you real quick, Greg or Bijan, whoever want to do it. Give us an example. I think, at least for me, right? I learned by example. So if you say to me, there was a church that had a fire and they had a co-insurance requirement of 20%, that type of thing. So if you can give an example, I think that might be a little bit helpful for clarification purposes.
We had a major fire in a church in Texas. And it had two issues. One, they had enough insurance to originally, and by the way, this was one of our companies. This was not our client, and because we try not to have these in our agency, but this was this church had enough insurance to replace the building, but they had improperly evaluated the stained glass. And so when I said earlier that we have a church in Upper West Side, that the stained glass is worth more than the building, that's what happened in this Texas church. And they had a 80% co-insurance on top of that. So not only did it not cover the stained glass, which was evaluated higher than the building itself, Then they had a penalty because part of the building was left intact. And so even though they had this big policy, they only got 80% of what they were supposed to do because the building was so underinsured. The agent is a good friend of ours, and he knew that he had messed this up and hadn't paid attention to the valuation. And they ended up suing him, or suing his company, and they paid the loss, but it was a horrible thing for the church to have to go through. The horrible thing for the agent to go through. It was just a big mess. And so it's just one of those situations where valuations really, really do matter. And typically what we've seen in our industry is that if somebody goes to a church and says, we want to write your insurance, and they say, okay, let's get a quote, that agent would look at what the building coverage was on the old policy, and they would put that in their policy, and you're just quoting against something that you don't really know if it's right or not. But hey, this guy did it, so we'll do it. And we never do that. We evaluate every piece of property that we go into, because we don't want to be that guy and have that problem with your church. That's not, no church should. You guys are doing such an important work. You do not need to be worried about, do you have the right insurance on your property?
I see, Naomi, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I don't know if it applies, this question applies but as a trustee, as a point of information for myself, our church houses 2 congregations. And my question is our church, which is the Spanish congregation, do they need to have a separate insurance because we are a separate congregation within the building? I need to understand that, because that has been my concern for a while.
Okay, Bjorn?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the way that we would look at that, and that the insurance company would look at that, is the oversight of the church, not necessarily the congregation. So if the churches have separate boards of directors and are under kind of separate leadership, then they should have separate insurance policies. If the Spanish speaking church is just kind of a ministry of the main church and is under the same board, then they could be on the same policy.
Okay, thank you. That clears it for me. We are the Board of Trustees. We are one Board of Trustees.
Okay.
So thank you for that information.
I do see a question in the chat.
I was just
What
about
are
to
your
say.
thoughts on changing insurance companies every couple of years? If we're your agency, the answer is no, you should not do that, because we don't want to lose a client. The question really should be not about the insurance policy. It should be about the risk management of your church. The real issue is, do we feel like we've been heard? Do we feel like the agent understands exactly what we're doing? Do they understand we have this food pantry or this closet for needs? Do they understand that we have a youth ministry that does these certain things? That's the people that manage your risks, your liability issues, who go through these things with you. That's where you want to be. And the more you can build a relationship with that kind of an organization, whether it's us or, there are a lot of good church agencies out there, but you're going to want to have somebody who really manages your risk with you, and can provide the coverages that make you not have to worry about this in the middle of the night.
Well, that was my question. I have a twofold question. One is, how do we know that the valuation that the insurance company gives us is accurate? Right. And the other thing, what you said is correct. I understand the relationship that we should develop, but we don't really know how strong or good that relationship is until we actually have to use insurance. Right.
Just
Bjorn,
a
why
little
don't you,
hermeneutic of suspicion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Bjorn, why don't you answer the first part of that? I'll go to the second.
Yeah, how do you know if your valuation is accurate? That's a good question because, a lot of the valuation is a little bit subjective. But I think, you can ask your agent or your company to see the valuation and to see what goes into that. And there's a lot of different things. But you want to make sure that it's including everything you have in there, like the stained glass, possibly a pipe organ, those kinds of things, and it'll show that all in the valuation. Even things like a commercial kitchen or pews that are made with cherry wood, that kind of thing all goes into the valuation. So if you look at the valuation and you see it's not including any of that stuff, then you might want to dive into it a little more. Like I said, valuations are to a certain degree a little bit subjective, but just having a professional set of eyes on it every now and then is going to be the best that you can do to ensuring that's where it should be.
There's a leading company that does this valuation called Marshall and Swift, and they use a program called CoreLogic, and we subscribe to that because nationally they seem to be really on target with valuation. So that's been a big help for us. We utilize their services all the time. If we get confused or concerned that, whoa, wait a minute, we're thinking this might be a little low or it could be high, we'll bring in some outside people to help us because we have to do this to stay safe. Coming back to the change of agent and how do you know if they're doing their job? I think building the relationship, the risk management upfront is good. Also, we know that people need to compare prices and coverages on a regular basis. And so we're an agency, we're not a company. So we have multiple carriers that we use, and we actually offer to do the comparative quotes on your renewals, which is, I think other good agencies do the same thing. Do you want another? You may have a company that you just love and you want to stay with them, or there might be some coverages they have that nobody else is providing, and you just want to stay for that reason. You can do that, but you have as a client and a consumer in this world, you have some things that you can ask for. If people don't provide that to you, that's an indicator that there's a problem. But most church agencies that I'm aware of work really hard to do a good job with their clients.
Am I correct to believe that the parsonage is also part of the church?
Yes, absolutely. And any other structures that you may have an apartment building or it could be anything, but all of that is part of the property.
What if you have a preschool in your church?
Absolutely. And we have the cover. That's more liability coverage than property, but it's included in the same policy.
So as we have 5 minutes, and I see that there is a question So there's one, get to market yourself. What are the benefits of choosing National Church Group Insurance? And thank you for the clarification about the difference, right, of being an agent versus the actual insurance company, that we recognize those are two different things. And the role of the agent is to find the best insurance company for the needs, right? As opposed to you're not going out knocking on Allstate's door or whatever other insurance company, but it's the agent who's doing the shopping around for that. We are mandated in terms of our book of discipline that the policy should be reviewed annually. Trustees, the policy should be reviewed annually. And that would mean an annual conversation with your agent to go over the policy and have it explained to you. I, even as an attorney, I find the language in insurance policies, like you got to know to go from one paragraph to the other paragraph and how they relate to each other. It's within your right to ask the agent to break it down to you like you're a 5-year-old, right? Make sure you understand the terms. There is a church in our conference that was supposed to have co-insurance. They never went out and got co-insurance, and their agent didn't do it either. Don't know why it didn't happen. Damage to the building, I'll call it primary insurer, did not pay out even fully under that policy because one of the provisions was you have to have co-insurance. So it even reduced the amount that they paid out. So it's really important that you look at the minimums. I'm going to put in the chat, Reverend Charles, I saw you asked where in the book of discipline are the minimums. The minimums aren't in the book of discipline. The book of discipline requires property insurance. GCFA has created what the minimums should be. I've put it in the chat. I put the link in the chat to the GCFA document that lays out the minimums that Greg mentioned. Are there any other questions? I want to be mindful of the time. It's 12:58. But I want to make sure that you leave here feeling like you learned something today. And if you have additional questions, Greg and Bjorn, would you care to share your contact information in the chat as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
When can we expect the recording to be ready?
We at City Society, we hope to be able to have this recording ready by next week. To be honest with you, we are really swamped and inundated with a few things this week that we must pay attention to, but we hope to be able to send this out by the end of the week. Or if not, I'm sorry, next week. Let me correct myself.
Okay, thank you.
And just some quick housekeeping. If you previously weren't registered for this webinar and received the link from another member of your church, please drop your name and contact information in the chat so that way the presentation can be shared with you.
We just want to say thank you. What an honor to be able to share with you, and thank you for all that you do for God's kingdom. This is a big deal.
Yes, thank you very much for having us. Really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you to both of you for taking the time to educate us and empower us so that when we go and we talk to our agents, or if we decide to reach out to you, we are more informed and we know a little bit more about the language. And I think that's really important that we're speaking the same language. So thank you very much again for this time. All right, everyone. God bless.
Thank
and
you.
have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.